Welcome back. Um, but by now today, I probably doesn't need much introduction. I'm just going to say that Michael Kaufman is going to do this keynote, and then there'll be a breath of a pause while we're then joined by the four white heterosexual solvent men who I handpicked for being a bloke, more of which I'll explain in a minute. But before we get to that final session, can I pass it on to Michael Kaufman, who's going to take this keynote session, which is really, I think, a difficult one. But thank you for doing it, Michael.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you. Well, I want to be clear about one thing, because I'm talking for the next half hour about men's use of violence, men and violence. And I just want to say, in all seriousness at the beginning, that men are not a bunch of monsters. When I talk about men's violence, it's not a blanket condemnation of my half of the species. I'm not suggesting collective guilt. I don't want any man in here, sort of falling under the seat in shame or whatever. But as men, we need to be talking about men's violence. We need to be talking about it because it's such a central part of men's experiences. There isn't a man in this room who at some point of his childhood, teenage life, who either wasn't in a fight or ran from a fight or talked his way out of a fight. It's part of our experiences. A large percentage of the men in this room grew up experiencing violence in the home, experiencing it either as a witness against their mother, in a smaller number of cases, perhaps against their father, although it's much rarer, or directly against you. We know that although the levels of sexual violence that girls experience is higher than boys, although there are many boys who experience sexual violence, the levels of physical violence that boys experience is alarmingly high. Both of us, being here in England and in Canada where I'm from, come from countries where the use of physical punishment is just seen as, well, you've got to do it. That's how you teach discipline. That's how you teach discipline. And then when we take it a step further and think about the world we live in, a world that's saturated with violence. We live in a world where violence against women is absolutely pandemic. There isn't a society, any major society anyway, where there isn't violence against women. It's impossible to read the papers these days and not see horrific reports of gang rapes, whether in India or the United States or wherever it may be. Stories about FGM, stories about trafficking. We know that the number one killer of women, 16 to 44 in the world, is violence at the hands of a man. It is truly pandemic. It is everywhere. You might even say it's epidemic. We read stories of rape used as a weapon of war, FGM, sexual harassment at the workplace and on the streets. We're inundated, we're surrounded, we're bathed in this world of violence. We live in a world, a male-dominated planet, where men, for thousands of years, have pulled out violence as the ultimate way to solve disputes, to gain influence, to assert your will, our wills, their wills, to the use of violence as an extension of diplomacy, as they politely say. We live in societies with organized use of violence in the forms of racism. I grew up, or at least I lived for about 9 years in the U.S. South, at a time when things were still racially segregated. An institutionalized, organized use of violence, not just in the laws, but reinforced by acts of individual violence and brutality against one part of the population. Organized use of violence against certain groups of men, certain groups of women based on our sexual orientation, our religions, our language, and on and on and on. We truly live in a world, a male-dominated world, that more than any other single factor, you might say, is typified by the use of violence. Well, the two big questions that face us in that world is not to spend the next half hour going over and over and over all these symptoms of the violence. It would perhaps be useful to, but it's not sufficient. What we need to do is answer two big questions. One is why. Why we see all that violence within male-dominated societies, and secondly, how can we end it? So the first one, let's just jump right into it. As you all know, there's been these long-standing debates, and it's the debate nature versus nurture. Is there anyone in this crowd who has not been part of that debate? Nature versus nurture. No, we've all been there. It's a critical debate. Well, there's actually, you're going to probably guess where I line up on that debate. Since I say we can end it, it would suggest it's not just nature. But there's a bit of truth in the nature argument. And the truth is this, that humans as a species do have the capacity to be violent against other humans. That is true. That is a human capacity. Not all animals have that capacity. I've never seen an earthworm attack another earthworm, for example. Maybe they do it underground. I don't know. But anyway, we as humans have that capacity, unfortunately. So there is a natural capacity. But we know it's not an inevitability. We know it because not all of us, most of us in fact, as adults certainly, do not use violence in our lives. We know that the levels of violence vary around the world. But we also have some good anthropological evidence. Several years ago, two clever anthropologists from the States sifted through the anthropological records. Now, some of this research is crap, some was good, but what was important about it is that anthropologists had studied, observed, lived within a huge range of tribal societies, societies that really gives us a window into the human past. And they sifted through all these records from 150 years asking one question. And the question was there violence in all of those cultures? Violence against women, violence against men, violence against children. Because if there was, it would tell us that it's not only natural, but it is inevitable. Well, here's what they found out. They found out that in approximately half the societies that had been observed, and many of these cultures don't exist anymore, of course, but about half that had been observed had violence, of course. They had violence against women, violence among men, violence against children. But in the other half, there was little or no violence. It's a human possibility, but it's not inevitable. And so then they asked, well, what was the difference between the societies with the violence from those without? And what they found, of course, was in each and every case, the societies with the violence were male-dominated societies, what we call patriarchal societies. Now, it's not because there were men in those societies, because these societies were half men too. It wasn't about males. It was about men's power. It's about power. It's about inequality. When I think of the slave societies of the southern U.S. and the Caribbean that only ended 150 years ago, when I think about those are societies organized around violence, so one group with a minority with my skin color would have power over a vastly larger group with darker skin color. It took violence to maintain that inequality. It wasn't as though people handed out, employment ads in West Africa, want a job as a slave. It's an organized, ongoing act of violence. It's about inequality. And so if we have a society organized around men's power, we can only assume that ultimately violence becomes a means to maintain that power. So let's look at why an individual man, where he checks into this. Well, first, you think of it. Are there any women here who have ever worked in a women's refuge? You've probably done intake, and you're interviewing a woman who comes in, and you're saying, when did this happen? When did he hit you? Why, quote unquote? And you'll probably heard stories that are now in our legend, almost cliche. Oh, he beat me up because dinner was overcooked. Because there was a crease in his shirt, because the kids were too loud, because he saw me talking to some other man at the shopping center, whatever it might be. And you hear these things and you're thinking, you got your jaw broken because the peas were overcooked? And of course, and we all know, it's not about the peas being overcooked. He is using violence as a tool. He's using it as a tool to maintain his power within that relationship. Just like he'd use a hammer to drive in a nail, he's using violence to control his wife. So the power of men within a patriarchal society gets funneled down right into that individual relationship. Added to that, the forms of privilege and entitlement that men enjoy just by virtue of being men in a male-dominated society. When we think about sexual assault, it's a crime of many things, including a crime of privilege and entitlement, usually by men, not always, but almost always by men against women or other men, because they feel entitled to have sex with whom they want, when they want, in the way they want. And perhaps the most pernicious reason, and these things I'm saying have just been at the heart of a feminist analysis of men's violence, has been what we can think of as giving permission to the violence, normalizing it. It's all around us. It's there in the world of sport. Violence among men that we celebrate. This is from Canada, our national sport, which is men beating up each other on wearing ice skates. We normalize it in the video games that predominantly young men play. We normalize it in our culture, in our movies. This is, I don't know if you can quite see it. Anyone recognize what movie this is from? Gone with the Wind. And when this is the end of the first half, right before intermission, because back in those days, 1939 when that was made, they had smaller bladders. They had to have intermissions for their movies. But anyway, this is right before intermission. Scarlett O'Hara has been flirting madly with Rhett Butler for the first half of the movie. She is what we would now in sexist language call a... Right. Thank you. And so finally, Rhett Butler's had enough. He grabs her. You can see she's hitting her fist against his back. And, this is in this dark, gloomy hallway. The music is swelling at this point, along with some of his body parts, apparently. He drags her upstairs. End of part one. Part two starts with in her boudoir, but this is 1939. She's fully dressed. At this point, the light is coming in through the curtains. The birds are chirping. She's as happy as can be. When this movie was made, is painted as a scene of high romance. What do we now call that scene? That's a rape scene. That is a rape scene. That's part of what many women are now calling part of the rape culture that just normalizes sexual assault. So it's just part of our culture. It's even there in children's clothing. This is a Halloween costume from the States. This is the pimp outfit for little Johnny. Johnny, what do you want to be when you grow up? Oh, I want to be a man who traffics women into sexual slavery. Oh, so cute. It's like, so we just normalize this stuff. It's all around us. The main way, though, that we give permission to the violence is we say it's a personal matter. We say it's a personal matter. Can I have a volunteer to ask a really hard... Can I ask you a very hard question? Yes, thank you. Don't be nervous. This is the hardest question you've ever been asked. No, but be nervous. So here's my hard question to you. Imagine you live in an apartment, and you look out the window, and you see a store being robbed. What would you do? Call the police. Is she right? Yes, it is. Thank you. There you go. Brilliant. Duh. Yes, of course, you'd call the police. But I'll tell you, every day in London, across the UK, across the world, people hear a woman being beaten up next door. Every day a woman comes into work with a black eye or bruise, and people don't say a thing. Every day at the supermarket, people see parents hitting kids. Do they call the police? Do they ask the woman, do you need help? Do you need some support? No. They say, it's a personal matter. It's a family matter. It's none of my business. That would be as if I'd asked you, what would you do with this robbery? Yeah, and you have. But I'm glad you have done that too. But if I'd said to you, what would you do if you saw the store being robbed? And if she had said, should I call the police? No, it's a personal matter between the robber and the store owner. But no one's going to say that. But when it comes to violence against women and violence against children, and traditionally fighting among men, we see it as a personal matter. But it's even more than this, the nature of the violence. This morning I spoke briefly, and yesterday I spoke at more length about the paradox of men's power, the ways that we construct manhood, this armor-plated masculinity that no man can live up to. Because we say to men, you will always be strong, you will always be powerful, you will always be in control, you will never show weakness, you will have all the answers, you will be invincible. And so we pile on. It's not just messages, but a whole world that seems to confirm that. And so from a young age, and then remember, if you recall from this morning, to the boy who doesn't live up to that, we dish on humiliation. We humiliate him. We shame him for not being a real man. And so we just get locked up inside. And so what happens with all this? Well, no man can live up to these expectations of manhood, except for me. I mean, and you, and well, all the studly guys in this room. But no, I mean, we can't live up to it. It's impossible. So what do some men do with that? How do some men not just make sense of the fact they can't live up to it, but compensate for this feeling they're not real men? Well, sadly, far too many men pull out a trump card, and they put it down, and that trump card is violence. And so there's a paradox. That man who may have just beat up his partner, or that man who beat up another man, challenged another man to a fight, bullied someone. They're using violence to have power over. They're using it because we've given permission for men to use violence. But at the same time, they're using violence to compensate for feeling that they don't have power, for feeling that they're not a real man. You see the paradox there? It's totally bizarre. It's because of men's power, it's an exercise of power, but it's also about an exercise of fear, of fragility, which is not to give an excuse to the violence for 1 second, but we better understand it. I want you to note one thing I'm doing in my talk. You have not heard me refer to violent men. Now, there are some men out there who are just oozing violence from every pore. It's true, there are some of those men. But most men who beat up a girlfriend or wife, most men who get in a fight at school, most young men, most men who commit sexual assault, who commit sexual harassment, they're not violent men. That man who beat up his wife over the peas didn't beat up anyone at work, stopped at the store for cigs on the way home, didn't beat up the store owner, but he's selectively choosing to use violence in that relationship. Let's not give him an excuse by saying, oh, well, sorry, you're just a violent man. He can say, sorry, I'm just a violent man. But let's name it as his choices. They may be unconscious choices, but he's choosing to use violence not only to exercise power, but to compensate for feeling he doesn't have power. And meanwhile, we turn men into pressure cookers. If we say to men, you will not have feelings, you will not have emotions, you will not cry, on and on. Feelings, of course, are part of life. They build up, ready to explode. And of course, if the one emotion we validate for men is anger, well, anger is fine. It's just an emotion. But if we haven't learned healthy ways of expressing our emotions, they're going to come out in unhealthy ways. And finally, of course, as I said, boys grow up witnessing violence, living it. And we know from studies all over the world that boys growing up in homes where their father uses violence against their mother are more likely than other men, more likely than average, to use violence themselves. Luckily, many boys who grow up in those homes decided at an early age they will never repeat that behavior themselves. And I've heard just endless examples of men or young boys even, young men, who at a certain age, 12, 13, 14, will literally stand, get between their father and mother and heroically, risk their life to stop the violence. And usually the end of that story is the man stops. He stops in total shame in what he's been doing. But it takes that type of heroism and sacrifice. So this goes on and on. It'd be obviously subject for a whole day of trying to unpack some of that stuff. But I said that there's 2 questions we needed to discuss, and we don't have a lot of time. But so first of all, that was the first question, why the violence? And what I would suggest is it's not just about nature, but it's how we raise boys to be men. It's about men's power. It's about unequal relationships between women and men. It's about hierarchies among men, because patriarchy is not just a society of men's power over women, but intricate structures of power of men over other men, mixed up with other systems of power, of inequality, of hierarchy. But what do we do with this? What do we do with this? Well, the good news of all this talk is that if I just said it's natural, sorry folks, well, you'd get to leave 15 minutes earlier because there'd be nothing we could do. It's just, that's the way it is. But because it has to do with the ways we've raised boys to be men, the ways we've constructed societies, it means there actually is a lot we can do. In fact, it means that there is a lot that is being done. Ultimately, what needs to be done is ending a male-dominated society. If indeed the origins historically are social inequality between women and men, men's power, the exercise of that power, then the feminist agenda is an agenda of ending all forms of men's violence. All forms. Not just violence against women, but also violence against men, among men, and against children. So that feminist agenda of equality, of liberation, is an agenda by definition of ending the violence, and that ultimately is not only the starting point for the struggles, but the final point. We have to change how we raise boys to be men. Boys need the exact same things that girls need. They need love, they need affection, they need holding, they need hugging, they need rough play, they need all these different things. They need to know they're loved, they need to know they're cherished. And as more and more men take on the equal tasks of parenting, we're going to see more and more boys raised with ideals that to be a man is to be a caregiver, to be a nurturer, to be empathetic. Again, many more things we could say about that. But I want to just talk about a couple of specific things. We need specific initiatives as well. We need things like programs in the workplace to end sexual harassment, and not these rigid, dumb programs like I keep seeing from the US that have these like absurd, 10 guidelines about exactly what you can do and not do, which are they just don't work. But really programs that help men and women understand the impact of their actions, because that's what harassment is about. It's not about a rigid set of do's and don'ts. It's about the impact of actions, of unwanted behavior, inappropriate behavior at the workplace. And so we need programs that really give tools to people, practical tools to people, not just to say, oh, you can't harass, but practical tools to end inappropriate behavior. And we also need much wider scale initiatives, and I want to tell you a little bit about one that I've been involved with for years, called the White Ribbon Campaign. And 3 of us started White Ribbon in 1991, so 22 years ago. 2 friends approached me. They said they wanted me to write something, a statement that men could sign. And I said, we need more than that. We needed more than just a few good men speaking out. We needed a vehicle for men in our thousands and tens of thousands and millions to speak out against the violence. We started this White Ribbon Campaign. This was back before there were ribbons for every day of the week. I think it was the same year that the Red Ribbon for AIDS was also starting. It spread very quickly across Canada. It spread because of the impact of the women's movement in raising awareness among men. And by the end of last year, it had spread to, well, we don't know exactly, but probably 70, 75, 80 countries it had spread to. Now, it has some fundamental beliefs. We believe and we know that while most men don't commit acts of violence, virtually all men traditionally have been silent about the violence. And through our silence, we've allowed the violence to continue. So a lot of the work that we do focuses on ending men's silence. The campaign is not an act of collective guilt. It's not an act of collective blame. It's an act of saying to men, we need to take some collective responsibility out of love for the women in our lives, to work alongside women. The White Ribbon itself, I'm speaking on the White Ribbon Campaign and I didn't bring a white ribbon. Let me show you how easy it is to start a White Ribbon Campaign if you don't have one. I'm just going to get a piece of paper here, and a piece of tape. There, good. So when I wear a white ribbon, it's not to say to the women around me, look what a good guy I am. I'm not like them. No, it's not. That's not what it's about. When I wear a white ribbon or put up a poster or have a meeting in my workplace or school, what I am doing is I'm making a public promise, a pledge, not to commit, condone, or remain silent about violence against women. So this isn't just another sort of cause saying, oh yeah, good cause, I support it. But this is making a promise. And I've heard stories from many men who would, when they first heard of this, said, when they first heard of it, they said, what a bunch of bullshit. It's exaggerating. And then maybe, they read things in the paper and they said, okay, there's a problem there, but no one's going to, no way you're going to catch me wearing, some stupid thing like that. What are the other guys going to say? And then finally, maybe the third year of a campaign, maybe a woman friend told him her story. And finally, they put on the ribbon And the first thing that happens, they go into school, they go into work, and other men ask them, what is that? And they have to become an educator about the problem of violence against women. It's also calling governments to adopt and enforce laws and properly support women's groups who have been the pioneers of work to end violence, men's violence against women. It's a catalyst for discussion. But enough words, some pictures from around the world, because they tell the real story. In Brazil, the biggest thing that happens every year when they're not winning the World Cup is carnival. So there, the guys go to carnival parades, go where the men are. In many countries, they've enlisted well-known men. These are 4 famous comedians looking very serious, saying violence against women is no laughing matter. And they've adapted the ribbon. They've added their own colors to it, their own national flag. In some countries, they use traditional forms of organizing. These are a group of men in Namibia who rallied outside their parliament building when there was a proposed law that said for the first time, rape and marriage was going to be a crime. And the media was saying, oh, only women supported this. And these men rallied and said, we support this law too. In Lebanon, just a public display to get men to stop and talk. Pakistan. Oh, I love this. This just got sent to me. This picture from Pakistan. This is in a community. The group there was trying to figure out how to reach the men, so they held a wrestling match. So this is the white ribbon wrestling match. In China, signing a public pledge. This is the southernmost white ribbon campaign. This is an Australian icebreaker that apparently is stuck. Anyway, there they are with their white ribbon banner. Do you see the pattern here? And the pattern is there is no pattern. And the reason there's no pattern is when we started White Ribbon, we decided it should be a totally decentralized organization. And we made that decision because we didn't want to set up, some sort of, membership organization with, secret handshakes and dues. And we set it up as a decentralized organization because we felt that people knew best in their own communities, in their own countries, in their own neighborhoods, in their own churches and mosques and synagogues, in their own schools and workplaces. People know best how to reach the men or the boys in their own community. And so we said, let's just make it decentralized. There's no ownership, there's no property, just let it spread, let it bloom. And so as it spread around the world, no one really knows, what's going on. I just, ran into the organizer of White Ribbon here, Chris Green, and he was saying, oh yeah, we did this, and this thing happened, and great, first I heard. So, a rally in Russia. I love this. This is a White Ribbon parade by ox cart or bike or something in Cambodia. This is my favorite White Ribbon picture of all time. This little boy is in his hometown. He sees people giving out these ribbons, and as a curious kid, he says, what's that? And they start explaining to him about the problem of violence against women. He says, stop. You don't have to tell me about that because I come from a home where my dad beats up my mom. Now, he could have gone on to be one of the men who repeated that behavior, but instead he said, can I help? So here he is, he's just given this ribbon to this street vendor who's looking at it going, what the heck is this? Except for in Cambodian. And this little boy is explaining to him about the problem of violence against women and why he as a man should be speaking out. Mongolia, police officer in Guatemala, some famous actors in China, from New Zealand. This little boy here is in front of a motorcycle because in New Zealand, there's this cross-New Zealand motorcycle ride sponsored by ex-gang members. And these guys, I visited them, how can I describe? They're at a central casting. I mean, these are ex-gang members, really, really tough-looking guys, and they roar into town on their Harleys, and they get off their bikes, and people come up cautiously at first to ask them about their motorcycles, and they answer by talking about violence against women. So just these, amazing initiatives around the world. Any rugby players here? Rugby fans? Rugby fans. Do you see what's wrong with that picture? Yep, good. Man, a few words. What he's saying yep to is this is an Australian star wearing the jersey of the hated rivals from New Zealand. And he's saying this is worth the embarrassment because I come from a country in which, he says it's even more embarrassing knowing that I come from a country where, my daughters are living in a country where 1 in 4 women will experience violence in their lifetime. So if wearing this jersey makes Australian men, think about this, it's worth the embarrassment. The Army, Navy in Australia, in South Africa, this man in Nepal, just on and on. Darfur, a new organization, Canada, Muslims for White Ribbon. This is the ribbon adopted by one of our First Nations, or Aboriginal peoples in Canada, adding one of their traditional symbols and putting out some posters. Do you see the other thing about the White Ribbon? It's a positive campaign. It's a campaign about men making a difference, using our strength not to hurt, but to work to end violence, and understanding the impact that men can have on younger men all over the world. And there's the website for the campaign here in the United Kingdom. Hope you'll check it out. Also, there's a white ribbon table, along with some other great tables if you haven't been to the next building over. So that's a little bit about the white ribbon campaign, and that I want to share with you. Is anyone keeping track of the time? How long do I have? I'm That was really subtle, Jude. It was supposed to be, start wrapping it up. I'm going to start wrapping it up. No, I'm going to wrap it up. Let me just tell you two quick stories, if I could, about the capacity of men to end this violence, to make a difference, to speak out, to find their own way. I was giving a talk in a small community once in Canada, and at the end of the talk, people hang around to talk and chat, and there was this one guy at the back of the room. This was in a church basement type thing, and he was at the back of the room, not making eye contact with anyone, looking really guilty, and everyone had left, and finally he came forward, and I was so tired by it. This was a long day. He came forward, not meeting my eyes. I thought he was going to, reveal some horrible secret, and I'd be there, doing psychotherapy with him all night. So he comes up to me, and he just says, Michael, is it okay if people copy white ribbon things? I was so relieved. I thought he meant, copy our flyers or leaflets. I said, of course you can make a copy. He still didn't look at me. So then I said, is there something else? And he said, well, is it okay, what about your video? Because at the time, some advertising company had donated their services. We did a 30-second ad on TV encouraging men to speak out against violence. I said, of course, this is a few years ago, we had videos then. I said, of course you can make a copy of the video. He still didn't look at me. I said, what? And he said, is it okay if I make more than one copy? I said, yes, make all the copies that you want. And finally, he looked up at me and he beamed, and it was just like in the movies where he goes like this. And I said, why? He said, well, I've made dozens and dozens of copies. I said, that's nice. Why? And then he said, well, my job is I'm a VCR repairman. And every time I fix a VCR, I put a cassette in with this message. And so when the man, of course, takes it home and hooks it up to his TV, and he turns on his TV, and there he is watching a message about the importance of men speaking out against violence against women. That type of spirit is actually sweeping the world. That more and more men have been inspired by the women's movement. More and more men know that thinking for 1 second that violence is inevitable as part of the experience of being men really is much too low a view of men is much too low an expectation about what we should expect from boys and men. These old notions of boys will be boys are ones that deserve to be thrown into the dustbin. More and more men are stepping forward as fathers saying, I'm going to take equal responsibility for looking after children, not just helping, but being a parent. And by doing that, transforming our relationships in which we raise children. More and more men stepping forward and saying, at the workplace, at school, I celebrate the equal place of women in these institutions. More and more men speaking out against the violence because they know it has destroyed the lives of too many women, but also too many men. And as we do that, as men step forward as allies with women, with respect for the women who've been leaders of this work to end men's violence, what we know, not only that we can end that violence, but right now, all over the world, we are together, working together, bringing men's violence to an end. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.